And we're so excited to have you joining us today, whether you're driving, whether you're in your study, whether you're on a treadmill, whatever the case may be. I promise you, this is going to be a game changer. And I say that because I know how excited I am to really delve into several of the subjects we're going to address. And our guest today is Eric Metaxas. And obviously, he's a name that so many of us know, those of us in leadership, those of us, of course, that are in the arena of the faith issues and what matters most, we believe, in our life and in the life of our country. So the name Eric Metaxas is a name that, from the professors at the university to the preachers in the smallest town to young people that are trying to learn and grow and mature, this is a name that we know. New York Times bestseller, written so many books. I want to tell you the ones I have and I've read. Martin Luther. I mean, man alive, that's something I want to devote 3 hours to, Eric, down the road. Bonhoeffer, Miracles, 7 women, 7 men, significant 7 men and 7 women of history. And of course, the bestseller, Amazing Grace, about William Wilberforce. He's written over 30 books for children. Many of them are award-winning. And so I simply say to Eric Metaxas, and I say to all of our listeners, this is the guy that has done the research. This is the guy that has the scholarship. This is the guy that's done the due diligence and meets all the academic bells and whistles. But more importantly, he takes that research, those facts, and he makes it so readable, so applicable, and so practical. So one of my favorite people, know him personally, and one of my favorite authors, Eric Metaxas. Eric, we're pumped that you're here on There's Always a Way.
Dr. J. Strack, my friend, thanks for having me. You make me feel, like important. I'm excited to hear what I'm going to say. And then I realize, hey, wait a minute, I'm the one that has to say it. You and I know each other well enough that we can joke around with each other. But I'll tell you the truth. I feel that one of the problems oftentimes is we can have the facts or the story, but if you can't communicate it, it's worthless, And so in my books, what I try to do, I mean, obviously I want to get everything right, but I want to tell it in a way that people maybe that weren't that interested are interested, because, sometimes I put in stories in each of my books that are, you say, that's just funny. I didn't read about that in the other book or whatever. So yeah. I think history should be exciting. It is exciting. And so, you mentioned Wilberforce. These are amazing stories. You almost think that, is this made up? No, this is a real person who actually did these things, who actually was used by God to change the world. And when you read about it, you cannot help but get inspired. There's no way around it. So if God can use me to tell these stories, that it thrills me. So thanks for having me on and for letting me talk about these things. I can't not talk about them wherever I am, but usually I'm all by myself or with some friends. So thank you for letting me talk to your audience.
Well, I'm pumped, Eric, very much. And obviously for somebody that can write children's books, in fact, one of the things I was going to take a shot at you on, how do you go from Yale to VeggieTales to Bonhoeffer, Luther, and Wilberforce, and have the access to so many leaders that you have? It seems like the Yale to VeggieTales, that's an entire podcast. But then from VeggieTales to what you're doing now, I'm fascinated.
The Lord makes us as he makes us. I'm a strange bird, and I've always been all over the place. And, you look at some of my heroes. C.S. Lewis, he wrote for children, and then he wrote some of the most extraordinary books of apologetics. I could think of G.K. Chesterton is another one. There are not many people, but a few people that I have really admired and loved who are kind of all over the place. They write in every genre. So don't ask me why I've written, I've written comedy. I've written children's books. I've written biographies, fairly serious biographies. I didn't plan it this way. I'm just assuming this is the Lord's plan. But I'm not normal, and I make no bones about that. I go with what I got. But if you can communicate serious things, whether it's a story of Bonhoeffer, Wilberforce, Luther, with some humor and communicate it in a way that comes across to people. Maybe they don't like to read long books, but they're reading this one. Why? Because the story is so compelling. I feel like that's what the Lord created me to do, is to take some of this stuff and to communicate it in a way that a lot of people maybe who wouldn't be interested in it realize, oh yes, actually I am interested in it. So it's my privilege to do these things.
Well, Eric, I'm very dyslexic, and to be Captain Obvious, ADDDDD, they've added a few D's, I think, for effect. But for me to pick up a book like Bonhoeffer, I got to be honest, even my closest friends and my family would go, what in the world are you doing? You're just carrying it around so you'll look intellectual. And I got through Bonhoeffer. And the reason I did is because of the way you communicate. One of the great truths, I believe, for everybody in leadership is we need to learn everything we can about communication. And if you do a word study, we know the word fellowship and the word communication and the word communion all come from the same word in the Greek. But we also know it means to partake with, to share with, and to have in common. And so you're a master communicator in being able to help us feel like we've got something in common with Bonhoeffer, and this pastor, small-time pastor, if you will, to become this tremendous influence through the ages is a pretty good example. But I thank you for your ability to communicate and your willingness to do it. And I love anybody that can have humor and help. And Eric, I've said about you behind your back, so I might as well say it. Eric looks out a different window. Okay, so I just want you to know he's going to look at the same thing and maybe feel as strongly about it as we do, but he's looking at it. He just looks out a different window. So I meant that as a compliment. Hope it comes across that way, but that seems to describe you. Now, Eric, before we go any further, I have to ask you the most important question. This is called There's Always a Way podcast. And somebody asked me one time what I thought the theme of the Bible was. And I said, there's always a way. If God be for you, it doesn't really matter who could be against you. So I always ask the people that I admire, what is the first thing with your background, your education, your research, your experience? What's the first thing that comes to mind when you hear a phrase or read the phrase, there's always a way?
Well, whenever I hear anything, I just think, is that true, right? Mm-hmm. And the phrase there's always a way is not true unless you're walking with God. In other words, when the scripture says all things work together for good, for those that love the Lord and are called according to his purpose. So when somebody says, like, kind of in a generic way, hey, I think everything works out in the end, or I think everything has a purpose, I think that's nonsense. Unless you have God in the middle of that, there is hopelessness, there's brokenness that leads to death and hell. If God is in the picture, there is always a way to do what he has called us to do. So sometimes these things just become, self-help things. There's always a way. Well, if God is in it, there's always a way. So that's the first thing we have to think about is this God's plan? Is God in this? Did God call me to do this? If he did, there is no way you're not going to get it done with him. There's no way. But I think we have to be clear. A lot of the world, they kind of push God out of it and they think, I can do it. If God is in it, there is always a way because he will make a way. But I think that maybe because I live in New York City and I'm surrounded by more secular culture generally, I think we have to make that clear. It's not about it has to work out because I say it or because I will it. Where's God in it? So if God is in it, there is always a way. That's biblical. Romans 8:28. Can you quote that?
Yes, all things work together for good for those.
I mean, it's one of those scriptures that I think about it almost every day. So there's always a way. If God is in it, he will make a way. If he's not in it, don't waste your time.
Well, I love what you also said, Eric, at the very beginning. First thing I do when I hear anything is ask, is it true? And I believe that's a great habit for so many of us to get into, to really, in this world where we're bombarded with a million random bits of information and noise and dust and et cetera. But that's a pretty good filter to have. True? Was that true?
I got dumbfounded. Well, when people say, is it true? This gets into deep stuff, and I don't know if we have time to get into this, but what do we mean when we say, is it true? I think, and maybe we can talk about this when we talk about my atheism book. My book, Is Atheism Dead? But I think even Christians have oftentimes bought the lie that there are separate truths. There's a religious truth, there's a biblical truth, and then there's the other kind of truth, math and science. And if you've swallowed that lie, you need to unswallow it and say, all truth is one. God is truth. He invented all truth. And we have to train our minds to think holistically, when we're talking about something like, is it true? And so I think you can go wrong when you're thinking about truth by thinking about it from a secular point of view. But if you're thinking about it only from a religious point of view, you've bought a secular lie, because it's the secular worldview that says there's religious truth over there, which really doesn't count because it's religious. And then there's truth over here. And I think Christians of all people ought to know that when we're talking about truth, we're talking about something that either God is truth and he has infused every aspect of the universe. So whether you're talking about math or science or scripture, whatever, God is in it. So all truth is one. I think a lot of times believers kind of get confused about that. And we think that there's Christian truth, and then there's only truth. So again, that gets into some deep philosophical waters, but it's good question, important question.
Eric, who are some leaders in your life? I mean, I would love, and I think a lot of our listeners would love to know a little bit about your faith journey, because like I said, there have been several where you've held on to that bar and reached for another bar, and you just have, continue to grow and be a voice. And I love folks, by the way, that are a voice and not an echo. That's one of my favorite things that I admire. But Eric, I want to tell us a little bit about your faith journey, because we have a lot of young men, a lot of young women, a lot of younger leaders, as well as some of us like me that have been around a while. But what's your faith journey, Eric? How did all this begin?
Well, I wrote the story of my young life and coming to faith. I came to faith dramatically around my 25th birthday. But I wrote that story in my book. It's called Fish Out of Water, A Search for the Meaning of Life. The short version of that, Jay, is that I was raised by my mom and dad going to church every single Sunday in the Greek Orthodox Church. But for a lot of people, maybe a lot of people were raised in the Catholic Church. A lot of people are raised in all kinds of churches. The question is, did you get the download? Did you get the truth? Did you get the whatever? A lot of times church is a cultural thing for a lot of people. They go, but they don't get it. And in my experience, going to the Greek Orthodox Church every Sunday, it was mainly a cultural experience that the Greek people, their community is the church. But when I went to college, Yale University, you're in this secular world and you start realizing, I don't really know what I believe. Do I really believe Jesus rose from the dead? I guess I've never really thought about that. I've never been convinced of that. Maybe that's just a religious truth. I kind of grew up with that, but now that I'm in college, we think different ways. And I realized when I was in that environment, which is a very hostile secular environment, which is why I have such contempt for these elite institutions. They really are very hostile to faith. They're not open-minded at all. And I realized that I didn't know what I believed. So it's not like I became some proud atheist, but I became thoroughly confused. And I graduated in 1984 with an English degree, wanted to be a writer, and realized I don't know the answers to the big questions. And I, being a writer and having some time, I had time to think about this, and it was not pretty. I thought, I have no idea what I believe. What is the meaning of life? Does life have meaning? I was just a mess. And so the bottom line is, I always joke around that, if you graduate college and you kind of float and flounder the way I did, instead of getting a job, you're on some career path. I floated and floundered. If you do that after graduating college, you will move back in with your parents. There's just no way around it. So I ended up around age 24, moving back in with my parents, just miserable, lost, trying to be a writer. What does that even mean? And I got a really crummy job, but the Lord in his mercy let me become friends with a guy, graphic designer. We're still good friends today. His name's Ed Tuttle. And he started sharing his faith with me. And I was initially hostile, really. I mean, just don't get too close with that weird born again Christian stuff. I mean, I'll talk to you, but and this went on for months while I'm floundering, living at home with my parents and trying to make sense of the world. And as I say, God in his mercy allowed me to just open the door a tiny bit more and more to the possibility that maybe being a Christian is an idea, or maybe just open the door that much. And the punchline is, right around my 25th birthday, the Lord spoke to me in a dream. It was one of those miraculous things that you think maybe will happen to somebody else. And all these years later, I almost wondered, did that happen to me? But it did happen. The Lord spoke to me in a dream very dramatically, in such a way that I had no doubt it was the Lord, that he was speaking to me, and that Jesus was Lord and the Bible was true. And when I woke up, it was kind of like Lazarus going from death to life. I mean, literally overnight, dramatic, miraculous change. But, to be born again when you're unconscious, that's kind of like Lazarus. Lazarus didn't exercise his faith to get healed. He was dead. There was nothing. It was all the Lord. So the Lord in his grace around my 25th birthday very dramatically, miraculously changed my life. And from that point on, I just opened my heart and my life. I said, Lord, lead me and guide me. And the Lord has allowed me to take this very strange career journey, working for Chuck Colson, who I mentioned is one of my heroes in my book, 7 Men, working for VeggieTales, writing humor, doing all of this crazy stuff, and then eventually writing these biographies and then getting a radio TV show. But at the heart of it all was the Lord leading me and guiding me in a way that I knew it was the Lord. And I just said, well, I will follow. And here I am talking to Dr. Jay Strack.
Well, I should have known Chuck Colson would be somewhere in the background, because what a man of God and what a man of faith, and his story and what happened with his life. So if anybody could understand what happened in your life, it would be Chuck Colson. He had one of those experiences in a pretty disturbing situation when it took place. And he's one of the men I admire the most. And I always worry that this generation, we have such low standards on who we let really influence us. And we've got some of the great bright lights that God has put on the planet that a lot of times we don't know because it's a previous generation, which is another reason why I'm such a fan of what you write and the way you write it. And that you would put Chuck Colson in with some of these greats from history, I thought really gave it great perspective. So grateful for that. Eric, so we asked about your background, and as you know, people all over the world, it's a phenomenon. And, I'm one of those conservative fundamentalists, and you know what a fundamentalist is. I'm a fundamentalist hippie. So if you can get your head around that, but, not much fun, not a lot of mental and a lot of damn, but as you put it all together, is somebody that just believes it's got to be talked about in this book, or it's not in play. And then to travel the world and meet folks of every background who've been having a dream. And when they talk about it, it's so real and so personal. And God is really doing a movement today. And I'm sure you've heard about it, especially in the Muslim world, the Middle East. But it's very interesting, the ways in which Jesus is calling people.
There's no doubt about it. And again, it's not like I had anything to do with it. I was literally unconscious. It was an actual dream. It wasn't a dream in a metaphorical sense, like I have a dream to do this in my life, but I have those too, and the Lord's in that. But this was a literal dream that was really like a vision. When somebody has a vision where God speaks to them in a vision, that's what this was like. Except it was in the context of a dream, but it was otherworldly. It wasn't like something that comes out of your brain. It's more like watching a TV screen than it was kind of watching your own thoughts. But it changed my life, and it certainly proved to me not just that Jesus is Lord and the Bible is true, but it proved to me that miracles can happen to anybody, because it happened to me. I've had other miracles after that, but this was completely life-changing. Had nothing to do with me and changed my life.
Are there a couple other leaders that have had a profound impact on you?
Well, there have been many over the years, living and dead. And that's one of the reasons I write biographies. And I see this in retrospect. When the Lord leads you to do stuff, oftentimes it's after you've done it that you realize why he did it. I never wanted to write biographies, but the Lord kind of, sometimes, he tricks us into a path. And I don't want to write biographies, but long story short, I was asked, do you want to write a biography of William Wilberforce? And I said, well, I know a little bit about Wilberforce. I don't know. Let me see, and I wrote it, and I realized that God has given me the gift to tell a story. So I can certainly tell if something's true or false or whatever. So, I'm not a scholar, but all of these people have done scholarship on Wilberforce. And I thought I can tell that story. And I told the story, and it comes out in a book, Amazing Grace. And then people said, well, who are you going to write about next? As though I've kind of figured out my genre. And so I wrote about a Bonhoeffer. But the point is, if you'd said to me when I was writing about those first two books, why are you writing these books? I wouldn't have had the same answer that I have now. And the answer I have now is I realize in retrospect that God speaks to us through stories and through the lives of people more than he speaks to us in bullet points. When you come up alongside a life like a Wilberforce or a Bonhoeffer, it will change you in the same way that the people around you will change you. I look at my father, who by God's grace is still with us at 94. He is a major figure and a hero in my life. But there are people whose stories you read. So at this point, I would say that there are a number of people alive who've had an influence on me, but there are a number of people no longer living, but we know enough about them and their stories that you can't help but be influenced by them. And so that's why I know God called me to write these books, because number one, writing about Wilberforce and Bonhoeffer influenced my life. I am different because of my encounter with these two figures and their stories. And in the course of a book, it's kind of like you get to know somebody as though you really were with them. So, I mentioned my dad kind of laying down a base in my life. He was not an evangelical Christian, but the difference between right and wrong, the difference between being honorable and dishonorable, the difference between paying your debts or not paying your debts, doing the right thing. I just grew up with that. And I look back on it. I think a lot of Christians yap about Jesus, but they don't have those things figured out. We need to be men and women of our word. When you say something, you will do it. Don't say, I'll pray for you, and then don't do it. Better that you just don't say it. We need to be people of. So my father was and is that kind of a man. He can't quote scripture, but he knows the difference between right and wrong, honor and dishonor and stuff. And so sometimes, again, we believers, we tend to separate out kind of, there's religious truth, biblical truth, and then there's the other truth, pagan truth, which is, of the devil works righteousness. That's garbage, folks. What's true is true. Lying is wrong. Not paying your bills or not paying your debts is wrong. Saying you're going to do something and not doing it is wrong. You don't need to be a born-again believer to know those things. Now, we know all those things derive from Jesus, but there are a lot of people out there that they don't have the faith we do, but they get those things. And I really do think that sometimes that's sort of the problem we have in the body of Christ, is we talk about God and the Bible almost to the exclusion of some of these other things. Truth, as I said before, it's one. Truth is one. And so I do believe that my dad just, I didn't mention the self-sacrifice, which is at the heart, the agape love that we read about in the New Testament, self-sacrifice, which is the very picture of love. My dad worked hard and sacrificed tremendously for me and my brother and my mom. And there is no way that will not affect you. And that's why when we look at what Jesus did on the cross, that self-sacrifice, the agape love, once you see it, it wrecks you. You can't get away from it. You can't say, well, that wasn't for me. When you know it's for you, you're done. And when anybody loves in a self-sacrificial way, as my dad did, without even being conscious of it, this is just what he did for his family, it affects you. It makes you realize that I have a debt to pay because of what he did for me. I've got to give back. I've got to acknowledge that. So as I say, I think that these are fundamentals. And sometimes we kind of put this patina of, Christian, a Christian patina or biblical patina on stuff. And I think truth is truth. You can see it in the most unlikely places.
Greek herb?
What's that?
Is it a Greek herb or what?
Something like that. Something.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's kind of like when I go to Louisiana and they say, man, you put some lagniappe on that. They're talking about all that extra sugar and cream and et cetera. So, but anyway, Eric, you know as well as anybody, and I've been privileged to kind of be in the trenches with you several times, but we live in a very divided nation, and this takes me right into Wilberforce. I've never really, I watched what happened during Vietnam and I was one of those hippies, and that's when my life, part of my story is what took place in the 60s and early 70s. But we are a very divided nation, more so than I've seen, I think, in my lifetime. And I just, before we delve into Wilberforce, because certainly you talk about a divided nation, Wilberforce was in that world and had to deal with a lot of those issues. But I just want to get your take on where do you think, maybe as the church, and I know that's a broad term, ought to be really listening to some of the questions that young people have, or are at least responding better, maybe be more proactive. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but what is your take on where we are as a nation right now?
Well, we've never been where we are right now. The madness of, well, let's put it this way. Oftentimes, some people are familiar with, Reagan's trickle-down economics theory, which is true, it's right. But there's also trickle-down culture. The elites, and I talk about this in my book, Is Atheism Dead? They took God out, around the time of Darwin, 1859, Origin of the Species. We can account for, all of the life on planet Earth without God. Once that happened, it kind of, it affected and infected the academic establishment and the cultural elites, but it took until our lifetime for this stuff to trickle down to where Time Magazine puts out an article, Is God Dead? And the reason I bring this up is that these ideas, like all ideas through history, they take time to work themselves, like a little leaven works its way through the dough, through the lump. We are now seeing the fruit of taking God out. And what I mean is the cultural Marxism that has exploded, whether you're talking about critical race theory, intersectionality, when you're talking about socialism, redistribution of wealth, all of these crazy ideas are the fruit of effectively Marxism, which is atheist Marxism. You take God out and you try to create a system where you can get to all this good stuff, this utopia without God. Well, first of all, it doesn't work. But second of all, we've never seen it like we're seeing it now, where it has come into the mainstream. And so the challenge, to my mind, for believers, for leaders, is to stand against it. Every generation has lies that it has to say, am I going to stand against this, or am I going to kind of look the other way while this wave crashes? I think the challenge has never been keener in the church for people to say, this is atheist Marxism wearing all these different costumes, using all these different names that try to make it sound humane and kind. But the fact of the matter is these are lies. And I think that many in the church today, they don't have the clarity to see this, or they don't want to see it. They want to look the other way. We're in a horrible battle. And those of us who have spoken out against this realize there's a price to pay when you talk about these things, because let's just say whether it's BLM or the rainbow flag agenda, there is a human side to these things. Okay, there are people struggling. There are people. Okay, so we're meant to be compassionate, to try to be understanding. But there also is a point where you say, wait a second, that solution is evil. That is not true. That is going to hurt people. So if I care about the urban poor, if I care about Black people in America, which I'm called to love everyone, right? I need to speak out against Black Lives Matter. Why? Because it is effectively Marxism, socialism. It's anti-biblical, but it's wrapped itself in a kind of it says, well, if you don't agree with this, you're a bigot. Having to stand up in this day and age in America and say, I stand against that, or I stand against this transgender movement, I stand against intersectionality and the idea that systemic racism. These are all, they're not just wrong ideas, bad ideas, but they're deeply harmful. But today, to speak out against those things, to take a stand against them, you realize there's a price. And I paid that price, but I think that how can you write about a Bonhoeffer or a Wilberforce who paid huge prices, and then in your own life say, you know what, I don't want my friends to think ill of me. I'm just going to keep my mouth shut on this one. God forbid we keep our mouths shut at a time when, there's sirens all around. Can you hear that? I'm in New York City.
I think
God forbid that we keep our mouths shut in the case of where we are now. And I often say too, that if you want to know what you would have done, would you have been like a Bonhoeffer? Would you have been like a Wilberforce? Or would you have been like everybody else? How you're acting now will give you a clue to that. Because right now it's very easy to say, I'm going to avoid these subjects. I don't want to be divisive. Do you think it was divisive to say slavery is wrong in 1850 or when Wilberforce was alive? Do you think that was divisive? It was unbelievably divisive. But he felt a compulsion from God to lovingly speak the truth, knowing some people are going to say, I hate you, you're my enemy, and I want to do everything I can to shut you up. But he said, God gave his life for me. I'm compelled to do what I can. And by the way, because I believe Jesus is real, because I believe he really defeated death on the cross, I'm not afraid of death. I'm not afraid of my career tanking. I'm not afraid of anything. I'm only afraid of not doing what God has called me to do. I'm only afraid of not speaking what God has called me to speak. That's the long answer. But where we are now is right in the middle of the kind of stuff that we've seen it in history, but it has now come to us, and particularly to people in the church. Will I be able to take a stand against this, or will I be afraid of being labeled political? You get your eyes off the gospel. How do you talk about the gospel when there are people suffering, when there are people being lied to? So it's a kind of a conundrum. And just to finish the point, it gets to this lie that there's like religious truth and then there's other truth. There's only truth. And if I don't speak out against slavery, if I don't speak out against the killing of the Jews, if I don't speak out against the lies of the transgender stuff that is being pushed on children, if I don't speak out against the lies that the Black Lives Matter contingent are pushing on the culture, that are destroying Black lives, if I don't speak out against that because I'm afraid of what people think of me, shame on me.
Well said, Eric. the other day I said, listen, because we have a lot of students, and so I get asked some of these questions, and you certainly know what that's like. And I said, let me tell you something, man, where I grew up, my background, listen, I am colorblind, because where I came up, we were all in this together. And it was a mess, what in my world, what we were all in. I said, I want to change things. I don't want anybody to be hurt. I don't want anybody to be beaten up or bullied. I don't want anybody to lose a job. I don't want any of those things. But you have to understand, I'll do anything to help heal. But there's two things. Just know there's no way I can do, nor do I want to, nor would I. Number one, I can't rewrite the Constitution. And more importantly, I can't rewrite the Word of God. So if I can be full of grace and truth, that's my goal, because that's what Christ was. But I'm not going to rewrite those two documents, the Word of God and the Constitution, in order to fit in or to be popular or to be a voice. Or really an echo is what everybody wants. We want echoes more than voices. So
well,
thank you.
That to me is the horror. And you forgive me for rambling on, but we're talking about big stuff here. This is huge stuff. And I never thought that I would have to stick my neck out on some of these issues. And I also never thought that my brothers and sisters in Christ, many of them would say, I'm going to take a pass on this one. I don't want to stick my neck out. I don't want to be labeled, a conspiracy theorist or this or that. I thought, surely the body of Christ, we can agree on all these things, but you realize that through history, in the time of Wilberforce and at the time of Bonhoeffer, many good people in the church, these are not wicked people, good people, got it wrong. And now we look back and we say, oh, it's so easy to understand the right answer. But in that time, when Wilberforce was a lonely voice speaking against the slave trade, when Bonhoeffer was a lonely voice speaking against the Nazis, it was tough for them. And I think that right now, it is tough for many of us to speak the truth. We see that you have to count the cost. Are you gonna do it or not? It's easier to shut up, but God forbid that we shut up.
So Eric, there's probably a good reason why that if a young person or an adult but is going, I really realize I need to put some people into my life that will speak truth. I need to put some dead people in my life that will speak truth. How would you introduce Wilberforce? What makes Wilberforce the person that we ought to read about? What would be the one we would say, you know what? I really want to look at that life because I see what he's done. Can you give us any insights into what made Wilberforce what he was, as well as? It's
actually with Wilberforce, it's kind of easy to answer that. Wilberforce was alive at a time in England. Okay, so he was born 1759, died 1833. While he was alive in England, England said we're a Christian nation. But they didn't say like we say in America, oh, we're a Christian nation. In America, we're not officially a Christian nation. In America, we are officially nothing. We say that, our foundation is Christian, but we don't say that we're officially Christian. We don't say that. Right. England said we are officially Christian. And so Wilberforce is alive at a time when, even though they say they're officially the country that he is a member of parliament, powerful political figure, they say they're officially Christian. He sees that Christian thinking has not come into the life of English culture at that time. They had slavery. They had all kinds of things that we today would say, surely a Christian nation would not have that. And what it makes us all realize is that just because you say you're Christian means nothing, because you look at a person's life, you look at the actions. So yes, it's like if you have a friend who says, I am a Christian, and then you look at their life and you see like some real problems. And you say, well, I hope he's saved, but I don't see fruit. I don't see him getting half of what you should get if you're walking with Christ. So the reason Wilberforce is interesting is you look at a time in history when, even though the nation says we are officially Christian, the life of the nation was deeply pagan. So the reason I say this is that the brokenness of English culture at the time of Wilberforce, it was so broken, it's almost like a test case. In comes this man, Wilberforce, who gets saved around age 26 or something. He has this profound conversion. Suddenly, he sees everything differently. Jesus comes into the picture, and Wilberforce sees through the eyes of Jesus. He looks around the British culture. He says, wait a second. If we're a Christian nation, we need to abolish slavery. Why haven't we done that? If we're a Christian nation, we need to abolish child labor. Little children are working 14 hours a day in dangerous conditions. Where's the humanity? Where's the love? How is Jesus and the Christian faith reflected in our culture? And he saw that I'm a member of parliament. God has called me through politics and other things that he did to lead this nation to being in reality a Christian nation, a nation that cares for the poor. We worry about, today we argue about, should the government take care of the poor or should the churches take it? We argue about how to get it done. In those days, nobody cared about the poor. The gospel faith that they said that they had by being Christians hadn't worked its way down to where they understood, oh, that means I have to care about my neighbor. I have to care about the poor. So when you look at the story of a Wilberforce, you have like a test case. You have a deeply pagan culture. Into it comes this man who now encounters Jesus and says, okay, Lord, what's it going to look like if I bring you into this culture? And the answer is mind-blowing. Wilberforce was used by God to totally change the culture. When you bring Jesus into the picture, you can see glorious changes in every direction. And I think to myself, it's almost like a test case, except this is a true story. So Wilberforce, the number one thing he's known for, the big thing, is the abolition of the slave trade. He says, this is an abomination. We say we're a Christian nation, and we are countenancing one of the most wicked things in history, the slave trade and slavery. We need to stop this. So he leads the battle to bring Jesus into that question and to say that these slaves, they're made in the image of God, and we cannot treat them this way. So that's the number one thing. But everywhere you look, Wilberforce affected other parts of British culture that we would all say, my goodness, you mean they didn't do that back then? He sort of had a really genuinely pagan, canvas on which to paint with the paint of Jesus. And it's so dramatic, the world that he comes into as a young man, how pagan it is, and how God used one man. I mean, again, it's almost like you made it up, except no, this is a true story. One man to lead the charge and to bring Christian influence and Christian worldview into every aspect of English society. So by the time he dies, 1833, you have the beginnings of what we know of as the Victorian era, which we now know is famous for morality and women forming little groups to say, how can we help the poor? Before Wilberforce, that wasn't on the table, but God used him to bring Jesus into all these different areas. And so I think, just as a test case, it's like a novel. What happens when you bring Jesus into a place where he wasn't before? What's it going to look like? Except this is history.
Wow. Well, we know there were certain relationships that he had that he put on the table when he began to make this kind of strong stand and share his convictions and try to be an influence. Think about the prime minister. That's a pretty powerful person, but he had the opportunity, and I don't think he ever missed an opportunity to take advantage of the opportunity.
There's so much to the Wilberforce story. People who saw the film Amazing Grace, the film Amazing Grace just scratches the surface. There is so much to the Wilberforce story. I would say the same of the Bonhoeffer story. There's so many relationships and so many things that you don't want to miss it. So when I wrote the book Amazing Grace, my biography of Wilberforce, I was so thrilled that I get to write about all these different pieces of his life and how he, you talk about doing the right thing. He, like everybody, I mentioned him, he's one of the 7 men in my 7 Men book. That sacrifice to say, I'm going to do the right thing. I don't care what it costs. And in every case, these 7 men gave something up major, but they said, I can't outgive God. Whatever I give up, I know God's going to make it up to me. I'm not going to worry about it. He gave up being prime minister. Everybody says that Wilberforce for sure would have been prime minister of England, but he was more dedicated to doing the right thing, to doing what God had called him to do. And today, most people can't remember the prime ministers of England in the 19th century, or even if you can, who cares? What did Disraeli do? What did this one do? What did that one do? Wilberforce changed the world. I just think that, his is one of the most dramatic cases of a man who said, I am just going to do what God has called me to do. And I know anything else is madness. And he did it. And now we have his story and we can look at it and say, okay, this is pretty dramatic. It's also true. How can this not affect me? How can this not inspire me?
And we know it works.
And in his case, the most dramatic change from being a pagan nation to a nation that in many ways really was living out the name Christian.
Along the way, we get discouraged. Along the way, there's a lot of battles. You've gone through them. I've gone through them. And there have been people that have been there, people of prayer. Can you tell us a little bit about the Clapton group and the influence they had on Wilberforce?
I'm glad you asked me, because I forget to talk about that a lot of times. A lot of times we want to make it sound like this guy was such a hero. And, Wilberforce would be the first one to tell us that without the community of his brothers and sisters in Christ, in what came to be known as the Clapham Circle or the Clapham Group, whatever it was, they were basically the people he did life with. He knew that to try to go it alone is a fool's errand. God calls us usually, almost always, to be in communities. So Wilberforce had many friends who he worked with and prayed with, and they often spent time living in close quarters. There was in Clapham, which is now a part of larger London, but back then it was like a suburb. And he had a very wealthy friend. It's like a superhero story, right? Everybody has different gifts and they all come together. His friend, John Thornton, was extremely wealthy. John Thornton had the money. Okay, so he provided money to fund building these gigantic homes so they could all live in community. And then there's a figure like Isaac Milner. He's like my favorite character in the whole book, Amazing Grace, a real guy who was a super genius. He could spend time, he didn't live there, but he spent time with them. There's Hannah More. I write about her in my book, 7 Women. There are all these characters, and you can't even believe that they're not made up. These are real people, but Wilberforce did life with them. They prayed together when there was a bill in Parliament. They did stuff that went beyond politics. They didn't just try to change the world through politics. They did cultural stuff. Hannah More was amazing in that. So it's this beautiful picture of how you can't say, well, I'm not a Wilberforce. Who cares? Of course you're not. Neither am I. Who are you? How does the Lord want to use you? Everybody fit in different ways. But Wilberforce, I think, would be the first one to say that without the group of us, there is not a chance that I would have had the courage, the strength, because when the chips are down, I've been going through this in the last couple of years, that you get attacked. If you don't have brothers and sisters who can encourage you when you're down, and who can inspire you, and who can just walk with you, it's pretty tough. And by the way, I would say that's the Lord's will, that we have brothers and sisters around us, that we have community, that we submit one to another, not just in our marriages, but that as friends, that we serve each other in this way. The story of Wilberforce and the Clapham Circle, it's like a seminal view of what does that look like. And by the way, they changed the world. So I think it's worth studying how they did it.
Well, man, Eric, you really do have a way of telling the story and telling and making all the different aspects of it. And I know we've just touched barely on the the hem of the surface, if you will, the hem of the garment. But so Wilberforce, was he famous in his day? Was he infamous in his day? What's your take on that?
Yeah, both. Wilberforce was famous in his day because he was, first of all, he was incredibly brilliant. He was a famous political figure before he gets born again. So he's a big deal in his 20s. At age 26, he has this dramatic conversion. And obviously that's in my book. It's not in the movie, but it's at the heart of everything. He's riding in a carriage through Europe with his friend Isaac Milner, this gigantic man, physically gigantic, super genius. And it's all something out of a movie. I mean, it's not in this movie, but it's a beautiful story. He gets converted, and now he has to go make a decision. Do I stay in politics where it is tremendously unfashionable to be an evangelical Christian? In those days, they call them Methodists, enthusiasts. They're the crazy people, the poor people. Maybe they need the crutch of religion. But in his circles, it's kind of like my circles in New York City, Manhattan. That's not fashionable to be a born again evangelical. Are you kidding me? He had to make a decision. I know this is true. Am I now going to take my faith into politics, or do I get out of politics because it's dirty? He goes to visit his friend, John Newton. This is, again, why we need mentors and friends. John Newton, long story short, he wrote the hymn Amazing Grace. He was a evangelical Church of England pastor in London. Wilberforce goes to visit him almost like Nicodemus in secret to say, hey, John Newton, you're way older than I am. What's your advice? I've just come to faith. I'm in politics. Should I get out of politics? John Newton says to him, no. Who knows, but that the Lord put you where you are for such a time as this, that the Lord's going to use you in politics. So his friend John Newton tells him, yeah, you're a well-known figure. Now you've encountered Jesus. Now the Lord's going to show you what he can do with you and through you. But at that moment, Wilberforce had to make a decision. And when he made the decision to do this, to bring his faith into politics, he knew he was going to catch hell. He knew that most people are going to sneer and are going to say, how can you bring your faith into politics? Keep it private. How distasteful for you to be yapping about your God and the Bible. We're sophisticated people here. We don't talk about that. So he was famous and quite infamous because he would not back down. Now, he was gracious. He wasn't just, a fighter. He was very gracious to his enemies. But it was a battle you could see in his soul. The easy thing to do would be say, well, I'll just be a minister. I'll just preach the gospel, quote unquote. Well, okay, except what if the Lord is calling you to take your gospel into the public sphere, into politics, into into making policy, into making laws? God doesn't want us to keep our faith private in this little safe religious sphere. He eventually expects us to take it into every part of our lives. And the Lord used Wilberforce to take his faith into public life, into politics. Because of that, England was changed dramatically. But imagine if he had just said, I don't want to be divisive. I just want to preach the gospel. I'm going to become a minister. I'm going to preach the gospel. I'll never touch on politics. The slaves would have never been set free. What kind of a gospel are you preaching, sir, if you don't care about the slaves who've been enslaved? If you were a slave, wouldn't you like those Christians who are talking about that stuff to actually live as though it were true? So it might affect you. So all of this stuff, as I say, it comes right to where we live today. This is, it's just not avoidable that if you really believe, you will live out your faith and it will bring you into places where you have to count the cost. And he did count the cost. And there's a reason we write books about him. We celebrate him today because he made the brave decision. He was looking to God for what he would do. He wasn't looking to man's approval.
Well, Eric, I'm so grateful God put it on your heart for you to write this book. I'm very grateful, as well as the books that you've done on the seven, because it really, both of them together, really gives us a picture. And it leads me to this last question. Is it safe to say, is it correct? It's not safe, forgive me. Is it correct? I can't say safe around you. Is it correct to say that the odds are very overwhelming that if Wilberforce hadn't made that courageous, heroic stand, that the odds are great that what Abraham Lincoln and several others worked so hard for? Do you believe there's a cause and effect? Is there a relationship?
See, that's what makes this so chilling to every one of us. What you do and what you don't do will affect innumerable people. You can't keep it private. If you don't speak up when the right thing to do is to speak up, there are other people that they're gonna take a lead from you. They're looking over and they're thinking, did he say it? He didn't say it. Well, then I'm gonna keep my mouth shut too. Wilberforce is the ultimate example of this. If he hadn't done what he did, he was the hero of Abraham Lincoln. He was the hero of Frederick Douglass. In other words, the people in our world, in America, who were willing to take on the battle, looked backwards to William Wilberforce, the pioneer of the abolitionist movement. So yeah, what if he had said, well, I'm not ready for this grief. I'd like to have a nice life in politics. Why should I stick my neck out there? Well, the fact of the matter is, every one of us today, when you look to God, he encourages you to do the right thing, knowing that he's with you in the battle, knowing that he wants to use you, but he's not going to force you. But if you're willing to do what he asks you to do, he will be with you. He will bless you in the same way that, he blessed Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer goes to the gallows. So it's not about worldly success. It's like, do I trust God with everything? Wilberforce is the happy story. He trusted God with everything, and the Lord, even in his lifetime, vindicated him. But I would say, when you're looking at God, you can't really think too much about your lifetime. You have to just think, do I do what God calls me to do? I let the results lie in God's hands. If it looks like I failed, who cares? If it looks like I won, who cares? It's in God's hands. I'm going to do the right thing. But Wilberforce, there is no question that the Lord used him. And, we don't have time to get into it now, but in the book I write about it, he influenced all of Europe. He didn't just lead the battle to abolish the slave trade in England. Once he did that, all of the powers of Europe that were engaged in the transatlantic slave trade, now the pressure was on them. Maybe they need to get out of the slave trade. And then the pressure was on America. So what you do affects others. What you do will affect all the people around you. They're looking at you. And so I just think that, it's inevitable. There are lessons here for every one of us. What you say, what you don't say, when you decide to keep your mouth shut, folks, there are people around you looking to you for clues. What do I do? And that's why the Lord says, I want to use you, even if it's only just to influence a few people around you. You have no idea what their lives might look like if you do the right thing, or what their lives might look like if you don't do the right thing. So in some ways, it's a frightening thing, but I think it ought to inspire us. God says, just trust me. You have no idea whom I can reach through you if you just do this thing that I ask you to do. So a lot of life lessons in the story of Wilberforce.
Well, I've got to be honest with you, brother and friend. Eric, this was powerful for me. I'm at the stage of my life where I'm trying to look at what's next and, how involved should I be at a certain stage, et cetera. And I can't tell you how refreshing and how timely and how disturbing that message that you shared today is. You're a disturber of the peace. I want you to know there's liable to be a summons coming in the mail.
Well, I have to say it, Jay. That's the whole point, is this disturber of the peace. It's a false peace. The Lord wants to lead us to true peace, which is on the other side. He says to us, stop clinging to this stuff which feels safe and right. Do you trust me? If you trust me, I'm going to lead you into real peace, and you'll find out what real peace is, because you'll only find it if you trust me. Well, we say we want to trust the Lord. Will we trust the Lord? But can you imagine how the Lord is exhorting us? He loves us. He wants us to come to him in all these things, to not fear. And I think we just have to remind each other, because it is not in our sin nature. We just want to kind of hang back, but we're living in crazy times. And so I feel really privileged that you let me talk about this, because we know we're living in crazy times, but the Lord called us to live in these crazy times. The Lord has a purpose for us in the midst of these times. And I am hopeful, very hopeful, and optimistic where we are today. I really am.
Well, you've heard it, ladies and gentlemen, and please understand, we've heard a word from the Lord. It's time to get out of the boat, take that step, and get in the water. And no matter how big the waves are, he says, I'm going to be there. Come and obey me, follow me. So wherever the Lord is leading you, I pray you'll, with great courage, just simply say, Lord, here am I, use me. Eric Metaxas, I'm grateful and I thank you so much. And I say to all of our listeners, these books are available everywhere that books are available. It can be a bookstore, probably at the Bible bookstore that you have even in your church, if you go to a church of a certain size where you go to church, but also online. But these books are life-changing. And Eric, thank you so much. And I'm looking forward at a very soon time, a very close time from now, to talk about the newest book. And some say it may be one of the most provocative in the sense of challenging the system of any that you've written, called The Death of Atheism. Thank you, Eric Metaxas. I wish you all the best.
God bless you. Thank you very much, Jay.
Thanks, buddy. All right, my man. Well, there's only one word for you, Eric, and I'm going to have to start sharing it. Show off. That was unbelievable.
Well, I'm not kidding. I don't feel well today. So if you thought it was okay, I am really blessed. I'm not kidding you, because I just don't feel myself today. I've been going through some stuff, and I'm glad. I'm glad. I don't know how long it was, but
no, we went a good 48 minutes.
Oh, great. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm gonna go use a restroom, splash some water on my face, and I'll be right back. Is that okay?
Perfect. That's okay. I'll love you forever.
Ready to go, brother. Don't go away. Okay. key. All right, I'm back, I think.
Ladies and gentlemen, here's the show off I'd like to present. Especially knowing you didn't feel like you were at the top of your game. I'm going, man, he really is a show off. But
no, I really mean it. I feel like really crummy today, but I'll tell you the truth. I know this, this stuff is in my bones. I talk about it whenever I get a chance. So I guess it makes me passionate. So that's a good thing. Let's see. Is atheism dead? All right. So I'm ready to go. I will survive. I'll be good. Here we go.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I want to welcome you to There's Always a Way podcast. And we're privileged to once again have our special guest, Eric Metaxas. And I'm telling you, if you heard the previous podcast we had with Eric, you'll realize there's a reason why he's a #1 New York Times bestselling author. His biography, if you will, his testimony is a book entitled Fish Out of Water. And I love that. And when you know his background and how he came to faith, that's a perfect title. And of course, I've got several books that I believe are game changers in my own life, my own library. I'm on a mission to make sure. We've been privileged to have over 260,000 youth pastors and students go through our various SLU programs, from the Lift Tour to the Youth Pastor Summits to all of our SLU programs. And I want to make sure that those three read at least, I've been saying, Eric, 3 books. I've got a feeling after this interview, I may have to increase that to 4 books. But the Martin Luther book is one of the most personally moving books and instructional books I've ever read. Of course, I love Bonhoeffer, the great cost that he paid. He gave his life defending freedom and what we stand for against Nazism. And then, of course, William Wilberforce in your amazing book that was kind of used as the basis of the movie Amazing Grace. But you've written about some of the great heroes, men and women of the faith, as very few can. So, Eric, thank you once again for being with us.
It's a privilege to be with you, my friend. You're very kind to invite me. Happy to talk about all this stuff, as you well know.
Well, I tell you, I don't know anybody better to address, and especially here you go once again, about the time I think maybe Eric's going to get out of hot water, you turn right around and jump back in without even sticking your toe in on this new book, Is Atheism Dead? And I know from a conversation we had, there was kind of a something that led to that title. So I think that'd be a great way to talk about this brand new book. But we know back in the 60s, there was a question and about a certain subject. And I think you've just picked up on that and give us the results of that question, as well as what could be at cost today. So Eric, tell us about Is Atheism Dead?
That is the place to start, because I don't want to give people the wrong idea that Is Atheism Dead is all about atheism. It's about faith. It's about apologetics. It's about evidence for the faith, for the Christian faith, which is, I guess, the theme of the whole book in a way is to say that the evidence for the Christian faith, for the Bible, for the God of the Bible, is so overwhelming that if you look at it, it's open and shut, in my opinion. But we live in a world that says just the opposite. We live in a world that says we think science is at odds with faith. We think that, intelligent, enlightened people look down on people who believe in the Bible and stuff. And I think, how do we get to this crazy place where there's all this evidence for what we believe, but where most people don't know the evidence? Most people are stuck on this narrative that says science is leading us away from faith. That's a total lie, but most people, including many Christians, they really haven't gotten the memo. And so the title of the book comes from, it's a response to, in 1966, Time magazine came out with a famous, infamous cover story asking, is God dead? So in a funny way, all the cultural elites going from Darwin, through Nietzsche and Freud and whatever, who were postulating this secular view that there's no God, that kind of comes home to roost in 1966. The chicken comes home to roost in the middle of America's living rooms. Time magazine says, "Is God dead?" So these ideas that really were only in the world of the secular elites and the academy and the universities, whatever, it comes right into America's living rooms. That these ideas have trickled down to where most people had this idea, like, yeah, I guess the more science we've learned, the more it pushes away the idea that the Bible is true or that there's a God. We don't need God to account for life or for anything. Well, that's not true. But in 1966, it looked like it was true. If you were just living in the culture, trying to read the tea leaves, you'd say, well, it does appear that science is giving us the answers to everything, that we don't need God. How did life come into being? How did life evolve into everything that we see? That it all happened without God. That's what Darwin says. Well, that's not true, but that's what a lot of people were believing. But the reason I wrote this book is because the thesis of the book is that we got stuck on that anti-God narrative around 1966, right when this Time magazine article comes out and asks, "Is God dead?" The elites and a lot of the culture just said, well, I guess that's kind of the way to go. And so we're not going to really take the issue of God very seriously anymore. And so we kind of got stuck during your lifetime, Jay, and my lifetime. We kind of got stuck on that. And there will always be Christians and stuff, but a lot of the intellectuals and the people that run things, they kind of had moved on. They believe that the question has been settled. So the reason I wrote the book is because, ironically, since about the 60s, the unthinkable has been happening. Science has been more and more and more and more pointing to evidence that says there has to be a God. Now, I never know what's more amazing, that science is pointing to God, or the fact that that's true, but nobody knows it. A lot of believers don't know it. No, hardly anybody knows it. So I met two people over the course of the last 4 years, let's say, two people who had big pieces of the evidence that I'm talking about here. And when I encountered these two people who I wrote about in the book, I just said, I don't know what's more amazing, the story of their evidence, which is astonishing evidence for God, or the idea that no one's heard of this, that until I met these two people personally, I thought, I never heard this. And I think this kind of gets to why I wrote the book. I said, there's all this evidence for God, not just since 1966, before that as well, but dramatically since the 60s, since just the last few 3-4 decades, evidence from science, from biblical archaeology that is so mind-blowing, but nobody seems to know about it. I said, I have to put it in a book. I need to show at least my fellow believers and hopefully their friends, hey, if you had any idea that maybe your faith wasn't reasonable, that it was anti-reason, I got news for you. Just the opposite. If you want to be reasonable, if you want to be rational, you have to look at this evidence and say, the onus is on those who don't believe in God. So the title of the book, is saying in 1966, maybe the smart people were asking the question, is God dead? Is that out? We're not talking about that anymore. Well, today the question has to be, with the new information, is atheism dead? So if you want to say, well, I'm not sure what I believe, I'm an agnostic, that's fine. But if you want to say there is no God, what I argue in this book is, in a way, once you look at the new evidence from science, which we could talk about, I don't see how anybody can plausibly say atheism is an option. You might have problems with my Christian faith or with what the Bible says. That's great. Let's talk. But the idea that there is no God, that has to be taken off the table, the way the flat earth theory has to be. There's certain things that are no longer intellectually plausible. And I want to stick my neck out and say, am I missing something? The evidence from science, only the evidence I put in my book, is mind-blowing. There's way more evidence that I couldn't put in the book. But I just said the question today has to be, is atheism dead? So if you're a person of some kind of faith and your faith needs bolstering, you need somebody to say like, hey, no, it really is true. Look at the evidence. That's kind of why I wrote the book, because I think a lot of times believers act like, well, yeah, I sort of believe it, but in the back of my mind, I got questions. I get rattled by these aggressive atheist intellectuals. The reason I wrote the book is to say, hey, don't be rattled. They don't have a leg to stand on, period.
Well, Eric, timing is everything. We've heard that all these years, but this is an age where how many times a day are we being lectured, just follow the science? And yet when we want to take it to its logical conclusion, like you're talking about in this book, they haven't quite been willing to follow the science that far, or may not even know about it. So I was just wondering about the timing of this book coming out. I think it's spot on, to quote our British friends.
Well, I'll put it this way. Part of what, and I didn't think of this when I was writing the book. It's often like in the course of writing the book or after writing the book that you kind of realize what was God doing in having me write this. I think it really comes to the point where most of us in American life today, for the first time, are really questioning the voices that we have listened to over the years. There was a time when you and I growing up, if Walter Cronkite said it or somebody said it, there's a world of journalism where they may not agree with us, but we know they're trying to get out the truth and the facts. That world is dead. We now know that all of these cultural elites, all of these voices, whether in politics or in public health or in science, we now know that the nightmare is real. They are speaking so much out of bias, we can't trust them anymore. Now we have to do our own research. Now we kind of have to be more cautious and accepting when people say follow the science. You realize that we've seen through that, whether it's climate change or vaccines, we just realize that the people that it would be very easy just to listen to them, but over and over again, we see that they have their own biases that are so strong that I have to be careful. And so the biggest part of this, in a sense, awakening is this idea that we've lived in a culture that kind of has told us over and over again that, science and being rational, there's a problem with faith. And I think we've heard this over and over, that even those of us who have faith have kind of internalized some of that idea. And in the course of writing this book, I realized just the opposite is true. Not only is science not at odds with faith, but the thing that none of us dreamt, science points to faith. If you're honest about science, it points to evidence for God that is overwhelming. So how did we ever buy the idea that science is undermining faith? To me, there's kind of a comedy to it. And, I guess what I'm fascinated by also, which I don't know if we'll get to, but the lie that science is at odds with faith has been pushed so much that even somebody like me who loves to read about this stuff didn't realize that not only is that not true, I mean, because I've read apologetics and I realized that, yes, science will always somehow point to God, although the evidence is now overwhelming. But even the bigger point is that it is Christian faith, and don't miss this one because this is nuts. It is Christian faith that gave us science. Not only is science not at odds with faith, or faith is not at odds with science, but it is Christian faith that gave us modern science. The emergence of modern science in the 16th and 17th centuries, we call the scientific revolution, came 100% out of Christian faith and Christians, and it is not something that you need to be a Christian to believe. I quote all kinds of people in my book who are not Christians, who nonetheless say it was the Christian mindset that led to this thing we today call science. And you think, even if you're not a Christian, get the history right. These things have never been at odds. How could we believe this lie or promote the lie that science is at odds with faith when it is Christian faith itself that gave us science? So we're dealing with some big stuff here. And I think when people get this, you walk differently as a Christian. You say, I don't know why I was slightly insecure about what I believe, because what I believe is beyond reasonable. In fact, what I believe leads to trusting reason, to trusting the facts, leads to trusting science. I mean, it's kind of, it was a wake-up call for me. Let me put it that way. And so that's why I get so excited about it.
Well, I love the nudges that come in your life that lead to some of these books that have been so consequential that you've written. Eric, I want to ask you a question before we, I got a ton, because especially this book, I don't want to give away the conclusions at all, but I'm telling you, that chapter on Christian Scientists and men of, I mean, some of the chapters that you have, not only do you deal head on with everything from the Big Bang to the origin of life and a fine-tuned universe. And I've always taught we're a privileged planet, you know, 1 degree closer to the sun, we're a Pop-Tart. 1 degree further from the sun, we're a popsicle, you know. And so we are a privileged planet. But the content carries us on a journey, your chapters, the way you laid it out. And I know you're conscious of that. I know that didn't happen. It'd be like saying there was no creator. I mean, there's got to be a grand design. And it's very obvious as you work through this book that you're taking us on a journey, but it's step by step. And I want to applaud you for doing it. But I also know many of us have coworkers. We have maybe members of our own family that will, a young student will announce to his parents, much to their horror, well, I'm an atheist now. I've now been to school, I'm an atheist. What do you say? So I know this has got to happen to you 100 times on a plane, or you've gotten through speaking, or as you go, folks that'll say, well, you know, Eric, I read this or I heard that, and but you know, I'm an atheist. Is there a couple things that we could say?
Yeah.
Help someone rather than that being the point of, oh my gosh, I need to get out of here?
I think, I mean, others have said this, but in the course of writing this book, Is Atheism Dead? It has made it clearer to me than ever that atheism in this day and age can only be maintained as a kind of faith. In other words, the evidence against it at this point is open and shut. And even a couple of years ago, if you'd said to me, do you think the evidence against atheism is open and shut? I would say, well, I wouldn't go that far. Well, in the course of writing this book, I realized I have to go that far. The evidence from science, the evidence also from other things that I read about at the end of the book, it is kind of open and shut. So if somebody says I'm an atheist, now I look at them the way I look at somebody when they say I'm a flat earther. I smile. I know Jesus loves them. I know that I want to show them the love of God, but to pretend like, hey, maybe they have a point, maybe there's, I would want to say to them, listen, I don't think that's intellectually tenable at this point. So if you want to say I'm an agnostic, but the idea that the universe, that this earth, that life came into being randomly by natural processes without God, I don't think that's any longer on the table. And I think that's a big change from even where I was a few years ago. A few years ago, I would have said, well, I don't know what to say. I would maybe get speechless because people have a lot of anger about God, about faith, whatever. Today, I would say to them, listen, your questions or your anger, whatever, those are all valuable. God loves you and he wants to talk to you. He maybe wants me to talk to you about some of this stuff. But the idea that there's no God, I just think we need to all be settled. Like, that's no longer really possible. The question is maybe, why would God allow evil? Why would God allow me to go through this hell? Why would God allow? Those are questions you can ask. But whether there is a God, I just don't know that I can entertain that very seriously. And I think in the book, Jay, I talk about, I say that the most serious atheists, the people that I would respect, people like Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, the French existentialists, they really believe there's no God. We're in a world without meaning. And they saw the bleakness of it.
Hmm.
They didn't rejoice. They didn't say, hey, it's great. I can, do what I want. There's no God. They saw the horror of it. And at the end of their lives, and this is like a big headline, they both came to faith, which almost nobody knows. And when I discovered it, I almost couldn't believe it. I said, how have I not heard this? This is stunning that these two serious atheists came to faith. But a lot of the more shallow atheists, the new atheists, Christopher Hitchens and Dawkins, they really are very intellectually sloppy, very intellectually dishonest. They're not really atheists. They claim they're atheists, but they just seem that they're angry at God, and they're viciously angry at people who believe. And I think that that's an important distinction to make. So I hope that when people read the book and they're confronted with somebody who's an atheist, they'll just realize this is somebody who maybe has been hurt or is angry or has good questions. But the idea that there is a good case to be made that there is no God, that no longer is on the table. And that's a big thing to say, but just based on what I know, I think somebody needs to say it. I think we need to put it out there. It does not make sense.
I know you've heard this term, Eric, deconstructionism. Are people saying, well, I'm an ex-evangelical because I don't appreciate the way the church has, whether it be transgender or whether it be some of the real unbelievable radical claims about law and order and about even some of our own origins. But what do we say to the next generation? We always call it the next generation, but our most cherished possessions are our children and our grandchildren. And they're the ones that are going to have to really primarily navigate this world. So what do we say when somebody uses the title, I'm an ex-evangelical, or I'm deconstructing my faith, or I really don't have any confidence in that anymore?
I think we have to understand that they're the victim of sort of nonsensical thinking. You have to have sympathy for them because they have a wound or whatever. But for somebody to say I'm an ex-evangelical, first of all, who cares about evangelicalism? Well, you're supposed to care about Jesus. You're supposed to care about God. So whatever movement that they're moving against, who cares? There are going to be hypocrites and broken people in the church since the beginning of time. Human beings have been broken and fallen. And I just think folks like this, it's like when somebody declares himself an atheist, it's almost like they're defining themselves by what they're against. And I just think that we have to, if they're serious about wanting to know about truth, have a conversation. But I think a lot of times folks, they're just clinging to something. They've got some anger or wounding that they're reacting against. And I think we have to know when we're casting pearls before swine. We're not called to get in arguments with everybody. We're not called to convince someone through debate and argument. If God calls you to that, great. If somebody's really wanting to know what's true, great. But I think sometimes believers get really like sucked into these debates and these arguments that go nowhere. It is not God's desire that we cast pearls before swine. You have to really say, does this person want to know the truth, or are they just acting out? Are they going through some phase that if I see them 10 years from now, they'll simmer down? They had different problems in life and they kind of see things from a different perspective today. I think we have to have the wisdom not to try to argue people into the kingdom. And I think that a part of the reason I wrote the book is that I just think that once you realize how overwhelming the evidence is for God from science, you have a different approach to people who are quote unquote anti-God, because you realize that you're dealing with somebody that they're at least slightly misinformed. They bought into some stuff. And so if they're honest, they have real questions, you can talk to them. But I don't think we ought to feel this obligation to convince people where they're mistaken. Some people are in love with these mistaken ideas, and you have to let them work through that. It's kind of like if somebody has, if a young woman or young man has a boyfriend or a girlfriend, and you just realize that's a bad relationship. Sometimes you have to let them find that out for themselves. And I think that a lot of times people have a bad relationship with truth or with ideas, and over the course of time, they'll figure it out. So we have to figure out, where am I in that process? Am I called to help them in that? Or am I called to just say, I love you. I want to pray for you. I care for you, but I don't want to wrestle with you on these intellectual ideas right now. On the other hand, there's times when I think we're called to speak out and say what is true in certain circumstances. I mean, the transgender thing is a good example. We want to do it lovingly, and I think we have to understand some people just aren't willing to accept it, or they've been brainwashed against it. So you have to use discernment. But I don't think we should tie ourselves in knots thinking, if I don't solve this problem right now in this person's life, that's the end of the story. I was talking to a doctor was saying to me here in New York, I have a patient, 12-year-old patient. He said now that he wants me to refer to him as they. He's picked this pronoun. And I said, okay, so, hey, doc, what do you think? You don't think this is real. You realize 10 years from now, this 12-year-old, when he's 22 or 20 years from now, he's not going to be asked to be called a they. He's going through a phase. His parents have enabled him, have coddled him into thinking that he can, reinvent reality. But we all know that, a rooster can't lay an egg. We know. We don't have to pretend like reality changed 5 minutes ago and we all got to, there have always been men and women, and there have always been some men and women that are a little confused and stuff. But reality didn't change 10 minutes ago, and we need to get with the program. So I think my advice to people is, there's time when you need to speak out. There are a lot of people that are really scared, cowardly. They don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, whatever. Sometimes, you're going to say something or take a stand that's going to bother some people. But then there are other people that are all too willing to argue about this stuff all day long. And I think those people sometimes need to just take it easy. Reality is not dependent on your arguing today. You're winning a debate today. God is God.
Eric, I'm a big fan of your writings, but understanding how you, I don't want to say attack, but how you develop a conviction has been very fascinating for me to begin to try to get my head around, in the sense that, you really do kind of take us in this book from that initial headline all those years ago and walk us through, what the argument was then, what the statement was then, but now look what was found just 5 years later. So you give us that, we're on the journey, but we get to see those aha moments along the way. You don't just begin, hey, listen, here are 7 proofs that convince anyone that is intelligent that there is a what you do is you take us on this journey and you walk us through the thought of the day, or the flavor of the day, if that's appropriate to use that term, on some of these theories. And then but in a matter of time, the evidence, we're going to follow the science, right? The science reveals that, well, wait a minute, that was never the case. And here's how we know it's not the case. And then you walk us through not only the journey of the community, the scientific community, and of those that were very devout. And then I love, out of nowhere, I'm reading about Sodom and Gomorrah, evidence that's, so I just, for lack of a better term, I love the journey that you take us on, and the way you give us a chance to read it, digest it, and go, well, I don't know. And then all of a sudden, boom, here's what happened 3 years later. This discovery was made. This person came to this conclusion, So I'm just want to applaud you on how you do it. I'm not real sure what the term is, but whatever it is you do it well.
Well, I'm not sure I know what it is either, but I'm glad I fooled you. No, seriously, I think what's so fascinating is to see how good people get it wrong. Even Einstein, you think that who would be the number one figure you would think of who would be so secure about his reputation or whatever, that he would just go where the facts lead. Even Einstein was intimidated. I mean, imagine Albert Einstein was intimidated by other scientists to the point that when he discovers the universe had a beginning, in other words, the universe didn't always exist, that was very controversial among people, because they said, hey, if you're telling me that the universe was created at some point, that's like saying the Bible is true. That's not science. So you have Einstein, through science, discovering that the universe has a beginning, and he's so uncomfortable with how that's going to appear to his colleagues that he fudges the math and the science to say, I didn't really mean that. It looks different if you look at it this way. Like, he was insecure. So I'm thinking, if Albert Einstein could be insecure, we got to have compassion on people who are afraid of what their colleagues think. On the other hand, you realize that Einstein had a lot of egg on his face when eventually he realized that, oh yeah, everybody else sees the universe had a beginning too. So I would have looked like a hero if I stuck my neck out back in 1915 and said the universe had a beginning, but instead I was afraid. And now in 1929, when everybody else is saying it, now I have to backtrack and say, oh, by the way, yeah, universe does have a beginning, and I feel like an idiot. He actually said that, what he called the cosmological constant. I can't remember the term, but he basically says that it was the greatest blunder of his life to be insecure and to not follow what the science was saying because he feared what people would say. He knew that this was a moment of cowardice in his life. And so to me, it's a lesson for all of us. The reason I write about it is to say that, listen, we're all guilty of worrying about what other people think. Even Einstein was guilty. But look what happened. Later on, he was embarrassed he worried so much what other people he worried so much about what other people were thinking that he himself backtracked. And then he was humiliated because he says, I should have had the courage of my convictions and said what I found, spoken the truth, but I was afraid of what my colleagues would say. And isn't that the story of everybody? So if it could happen to Einstein, let it be a lesson to us.
Wow. Eric, tell me about Sodom and Gomorrah, and we've got to go.
Yeah, well, there are two people that I met that made me write the book, Is Atheism Dead? In other words, when I encountered either of them, I said, this information is so big, nobody knows about this. I got to put this in a book. That's why ultimately I started writing this book. The first one is a scientist. I won't go into it, but he's a friend, Dr. James Tour in Houston. And he is one of the top scientists in the world. And he's a Christian. And he starts talking about how life came into being. He says, scientists will tell you 4 billion years ago, single cell life appears on planet Earth. But if you ask them, hey, how did that happen? They have no idea. And when he gets down into the weeds of it, you think, why isn't every Christian talking about this? That science can't answer the most fundamental question there is, not about evolution and all that. Forget that. How did life come into being from non-life? When you look into that, and there's a couple of chapters in the book that look into this, right. It is just shocking. And then it's shocking that we're not talking about it all the time, because this is like the biggest evidence for God there is. But let me just say, the second person that I met is a man named Dr. Stephen Collins. He's a biblical archaeologist. He's an archaeologist who I was introduced to, and somebody said, he discovered biblical Sodom. And you hear that and you go, what? I mean, you hear all these stories, people have discovered Noah's Ark, right. There's all this controversy and stuff. Well, when I looked into it, I could not believe it. I said, it's not like maybe he's discovered biblical Sodom. This is one of those classic open and shut, game over kind of situations. And I said, this is unbelievable. You mean to tell me that this thing that's written about in the first couple of pages of the Bible, this is back in the mists of prehistory, 1700 BC, 500 years before the Trojan War. I mean, way, way back, centuries before Moses, there's this account of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And it seems mythic. Even to believers, we say, well, I believe it happened, but we would never dream archaeology would be able to corroborate that what the Bible says actually happened. Well, we won't go into it now, but I will simply tell you that the more I looked into what he had done and into the book that he wrote about it, I said, this is unbelievable. I never dreamt archaeology and science could determine that this happened. But then the second piece is always the second, like I'm amazed by that, but then I'm more amazed by the fact that nobody's talking about it. I go, he wrote a book, the details are there. The secular scientists have weighed in, they have agreed, and nobody's heard about it. All my fellow believers, we've never heard about it. So I said, I got to tell this story. And so I tell the story in the book because we need to know that, just as I say that the more that science uncovers, the more evidence there is for God. And similarly, in the world of archaeology, and of course, science is related to archaeology, the more they uncover in the Middle East, the more it becomes obvious that the Bible is not a collection of folk tales, that it's history. We can find this stuff. But I think I have to close with this, Jay, is that why would the Lord allow us to discover these things now? Why in 1966 could all the reasonable people say, well, I think science is pushing us away from God? Why would God allow the evidence to pile up so that today, right now, the evidence is all coming out? I really believe the Lord has a sense of humor in a way. And the Lord, of course, he's the Lord of history. And I think as things spin out of control and we're looking around thinking, is the world going crazy? Suddenly, the Lord says, well, hang on a second. Have you looked at this and this and this and this? And suddenly we realize, oh my goodness, God has preserved this for now. This evidence for God from science, this evidence from God from archaeology, he could have revealed it 50 years ago, but he chose to reveal it now. Maybe, and I would say there's no big maybe, it's just clear, the Lord knew that in this season, in our culture, which has become so secular and so confused, that we need this now for those of us who have faith, to bolster our faith and to say, hey, if I had any doubts, I now know that God has given us this evidence in the secular world to point us back to himself. There's great irony in that is science pointing us to God, or that archaeology is pointing us to God. But as I said, God has a sense of humor, and I think he senses that we have a need right now to know that our faith is just not some crazy religious idea. It is truth. It is based on truth. You can't get around it. So wherever you look, science, archaeology, and then at the end of the book, I get into different aspects of atheism as an idea. The Lord has made it, I would argue, and I do argue in this book, he has made it impossible for anyone who wants to be intellectually honest in this day and age to say there is no God. That's no longer on the table. We have enough facts. It's overwhelming. And I say that's good news, but even if you don't like it, it's what the facts are, and people need to deal with it. That's where we are.
Well, Eric Metaxas, author, communicator, late night talk show host, who knows what all's in the future for our brother and our friend. Eric, again, the book, Fish Out of Water, your life story, your testimony. And by the way, dude, you are a fish out of water. I can just tell you, in New York City. Martin Luther, Bonhoeffer, the 7 Men, 7 Women, and of course, William Wilberforce, Amazing Grace. And now, ladies and gentlemen, drum roll, the end of atheism. So anyway, buddy, is atheism dead? And so I'm very grateful for you. I'm very grateful for your time. I'm grateful for your stands publicly and privately. And dude, just know you got a lot of friends out here. We're grateful for you.
It means everything to me, Jay. It's my honor to call you friend and brother, and to talk to you about these important things. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Buddy. Anything I can ever do. Peace.